Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson, as always. I'm very excited today to finally be finishing my overview of all 8 Schubert Impromptus. So today we have the very first one, Opus 90, number 1. If you want to see my videos on the other 7 Impromptus, I will include links to those in the description box. And I will also be uploading a video that will include all 4 Impromptus from Opus 90 in one performance so that you can listen to that at your leisure. I already have one that includes all 4 of the Opus 142 Impromptus in one performance, so there's a link to that in the description box as well. These Schubert Impromptus are some of my favorite pieces. I've played many of them for many years. Opus 90 number 4 was one of my very first Schubert pieces back when I was a teenager, and I also played Opus 90 number 2 and 3 throughout my teen years and into my 20s and 30s as well. Now, Opus 90 number 1, though, on the other hand, was a piece that I read through many times and I looked at it and thought it was really interesting and beautiful, but I always shied away from actually trying to perform it. It was very intimidating to me, actually, and instinctively I felt that I couldn't really do justice to it. It seemed very inconvenient technically, and also like it would be very difficult to have it make sense to an audience. And now, having played it and recorded, I can tell you that I was exactly right about that. This piece is very tricky to play well, and in fact I would probably rank it as the hardest among Schubert's Impromptus, even if Opus 142 number 4 is probably more technically difficult. This one overall is much harder to make sense of and to make work in a performance. In particular, there's a tendency for the never-ending stream of repeated eighth notes that occurs in the accompaniment in this piece to really descend into monotony if you're not careful. So you really have to keep the pace very disciplined and moving forward, and there's some very tricky issues of finger independence and coordination as well. Also, of course, there's the question of how to handle dotted eighth notes with sixteenths against a triplet accompaniment, which is sometimes very awkward. So having more or less conquered all those difficulties, I have a lot of thoughts on them, but first I want to talk about the music itself, which is absolutely unbelievably brilliant. What Schubert basically does here is he creates a very interesting amalgamation of sonata form and variation form over a grand scale. So what he does is this. Basically, on the largest scale, this piece is one extremely long theme, which can conveniently be divided into 3 parts, rather in the style of a sonata form exposition, and one complete variation on this huge theme. So far, so good. But then there are also elements of variation included within the separate parts of the theme. So in the first part, there's a statement of a melody, very simply set with minimal harmony. And then it repeats in the style of a variation with a new, more complex harmonization. It sounds very much like the beginning of a variation set. But Schubert does not continue. Instead, he moves to the second part of the theme, a new idea which is totally different in mood, but closely related thematically. It has the same repeated notes and the same dotted rhythm from the first part. So already we're seeing elements of variation form being incorporated into these thematic areas, and also a kind of interconnectedness between the contrasting themes. Then for this second part of the main theme, he writes a variation on that as well, shifting the melody into the left hand and making the accompaniment more elaborate, more refined, more beautiful. Again, after this free variation, he doesn't continue in that vein. Instead, we get a new melodic idea, which is also very closely related to the second one. So this very beautiful part of the theme is only one phrase, and it's immediately repeated with variations. So every single element of this main thematic area is constructed with some kind of idea relating to variation form. So then, leading into the variation on this theme in 3 parts, Schubert does something kind of interesting. He repeats a fragment of the very first part of the theme before starting the variation in such a fashion that it kind of confuses us where we are in the form. It almost feels like he's already begun the variation, but then it hasn't really started yet. So this kind of blurring of the lines is something that Schubert seems to be doing intentionally to lend a fantasy-like element to this piece. Now, this giant variation on the giant first theme is very striking. First of all, Schubert doesn't exactly follow the structure. It's very slightly condensed and shortened. Also, the accompaniment that started in the theme continues nonstop all the way through this variation. As I was saying, it's a continual ostinato that never stops until the very end of the piece. Now, the first part of the theme in this variation is basically just amplified. It's not altered in its original feeling too much. But the second part is totally transformed from its persona in the theme area. It's changed into a minor key, and it's infused with an unforgettable feeling of inexpressible sadness. And the quality of interior variation is still maintained here. So there's a variation on the second part in the variation, which has a very shocking mood shift into something very harsh and brutal. Now, brilliantly, Schubert keeps the third part of the variation exactly the same as it was in the theme. So there's a kind of comforting, warm embrace after all this minor key turmoil as we fall back into this absolutely gorgeous third part. Then Schubert continues almost as if he's going to start another variation, this time kind of hovering in between C major and C minor, wavering back and forth, without being able to settle on one or the other. But instead of continuing, the music kind of just gradually falls apart. The continuous accompaniment falls silent. There's one last ghostly reminiscence of the opening part of the theme, still wavering between major and minor. And finally, Schubert comes to rest in C major. So it's an ending in a major key, but this doesn't really have the typical kind of darkness to light feel to it that we'd associate with Beethoven. It's strangely equivocal. It doesn't feel triumphant. It doesn't feel conclusive. It doesn't even really have the warmth that we would associate with a major key. There's kind of a distance to it. It reminds me very much of the tendency that Schubert had of associating both the supernatural and also death with major keys. So one famous example is, of course, his famous song, Death and the Maiden. In that song, when death speaks in the poem, Schubert sets the music not to some kind of minor key rumbling or anything, but to a very solemn procession of hymnal chords in a major key. And surprisingly enough, it creates a very eerie, disconcerting feeling, much more so, I think, than if it had been written obviously in a minor key. There's another famous example in the Erlkönig, the Elf King, another song, in which the strange supernatural Elf King is painted in kind of insinuatingly bright major keys, and it's surprisingly disturbing and much more malevolent sounding that way than if he had been written in a minor key. So I think there's something of that at the end of this piece as well. And as you can see, the structure of this piece is really very unique and brilliant and quite unheard of for its time. It's obvious that this piece must have had a powerful effect on the various free-form variations that followed in the 19th century. A few of Liszt's efforts in particular come to mind, like his 2 sets of variations on Bach's Weihnklagen Sorgen. A piece like this also gives the lie to the idea that Schubert failed whenever he wrote anything longer than a short song. Actually, even in the grandest constructions, he can create a very cohesive piece that really pulls you along. This one feels much shorter than his 10-minute runtime if it's well played. You really have to keep the rhythm taut and disciplined and resist the temptation to kind of get bogged down in every expressive area. As long as you play it in a very straightforward way, though, the piece takes care of itself. Schubert has really written everything into it necessary to make it succeed. So now for a few technical notes. These are mainly for pianists who might want to play this piece, so everyone else, you might want to just skip on to the performance. I have the timestamp for it in the description box. The question that you oftentimes hear in regards to this piece and in Schubert in general is whether or not the dotted 8th note and the 16th note figure like this, when it's accompanied by triplets, if the 16th note should coincide with the last triplet or come after it. And you will hear heated arguments on either side about why one way is correct or another way is wrong. But I think the truth is that neither view taken pedantically is correct. I think we oftentimes fail to realize from our perspective, musical notation became so precisely used in the 20th century, and we don't really realize that there was a certain fluid nature to the way that rhythm could be realized in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. An example of that is the French overture style. Oftentimes composers would write French overtures and they would simply write a dotted 8th and a 16th, but they would expect you to play the 16th more like a 32nd, more like a double dotted 8th note with the 32nd. They just didn't notate it because it was understood. And I think it's kind of the same way when it comes to this whole issue of whether or not 16th notes should line up with triplets or not. I think there are places where it's kind of musically obvious that they should. Take the last page of Chopin's Polonaise Fantasy, for example. There's no way to play this really correctly at the right speed unless the 16th note lines up with the triplet. And I think there's many places like that in Schubert as well. Other times, though, particularly when the 16th note is in a separate hand from the triplet or in a different instrument, it makes much more sense to play a true 16th. In this piece, it's really ambiguous. I don't think you can choose one way or the other. I think the majority of the time you should try to play the 16th as a true 16th, so after the last triplet. But nonetheless, there are a few times when it really doesn't make sense to do so, particularly in this passage, which is the hardest and most troublesome passage in the entire piece. It's very difficult. You have to play 2 against 3 in your left hand and then also fit in the dotted rhythm in your right hand. And it really, I think, makes the passage too muddled and complicated if you try to pedantically sneak the 16th in after the triplet. It will probably also just result in an unwanted retardation of the tempo. So I say just really make sure the 2 against 3 in the left hand is clear and then let the right hand come kind of where it will. So I hope you enjoy the full performance, and please do consider supporting this channel if you can. One way to do that, of course, is just to hit the subscribe button and the like button, but you can also become a financial supporter at www.patreon.com/independent pianist. You can sign up to make monthly donations, which is of enormous help to me in bringing you this content. You can also just make a one-time donation through platforms like PayPal, Venmo, and Revolut. I have links to those in the description box as well. But at any rate, please do stay tuned. Next week, I'm going to have more great music and conversation for your enjoyment. So until then, this is Cole Anderson signing off.